in a state like Wyoming, how much do you see the message of police reform resonating with voters?
Yeah, look, this is a really fascinating question because I left Wyoming before the protest because I left as a result of the pandemic in April. The really interesting thing there was, I've stayed in contact with colleagues and friends there, and there have been a lot of discussions around about what does how does the Black Lives Matter movement play out in a state like Wyoming, which is, an incredibly white state, is the way to see it. And I think these are important discussions that people wanted to have. Like, what's our role in this? Even though we're, historically we haven't had these relationships. There are First Nations people that live in Wyoming, and there are some quite large reservations. But yeah, it was approached in a very different way. Again, I think one of the issues with the relationship between Wyoming and the police forces is that the largest city in Wyoming has like 60,000 people. So we're talking about relatively small states, and so I suppose in a way that has never come up. Well, that never came up in my discussions, and it's not something that necessarily came up in the discussions even post the sort of protest movement starting about the police needing reform. I think the questions were more structural, like how do we deal with issues of racism in a very white state. So there was a conversation had, but the way it played out in Wyoming was very different. And it's almost like the police there are almost like a small town police force, if you can imagine. Again, very the city I lived in had 30,000 people, but a lot of the places around us, had 500, 1,000, 200. So it's a very different environment to sort of what's happening in a lot of the urban centers in the United States.
Considering the platform that the Democrats are campaigning from, with references to police reform, climate change, which, as you pointed out, is potentially quite damaging for the resources extraction industry. Is there anything that the Democratic Party can do over the next 3 months that might turn voters towards Joe Biden?
Look, I don't think. Look, I think there's a big section of Wyoming that traditionally votes the votes towards Republican, and so that's not going to change in the next 3 months. The only way the Democrat Party can recapture or capture a state like Wyoming is by having a very grassroots and long-term campaign and building trust. Having locally grown, Democrat-leaning politicians who build a grassroots movement. There is definitely there's just no way you can drop someone in there who's going to change that history or that culture of conservative voting in a very quick way. I think the broader question for the Democratic Party is, what does its future look like? And what I'm thinking here is, there's been a lot of focus and a lot of anti-Donald Trump rhetoric, and that's been really the unifying agenda the unifying cry in the Democrat Party. We saw that at the conventions. But what's really interesting for me is what the future platform of the Democratic Party looks like. I mean, you could ask the same thing about the Republicans, but specifically for the Democrat Party, because we've increasingly seen, I suppose, more traditional Democrat voters come into conflict with their demands and their desires. For example, organised labour traditionally will support the Democrats, as do sort of more sort of green-leaning voters. But increasingly, if the green-leaning demands are to close down extractive industries and move, that organised labour then begins to turn away from the Democrats and towards the Republicans. So it's very, very hard that they see the common enemy as Donald Trump, but what reform will unify the party going forward? What reform movements? And I think that's a real challenging one. The second challenge, and this is a big one for both Republicans again and Democrats, is when you've got such deep political partisanship, it's very hard for a president to claim legitimacy. And you may love or you may hate Donald Trump, and that's not the issue. But the question that's confronting America at the moment, which is a really difficult one, is that if from the beginning there was a large section of the American population turned around and said, "Not my president," like before him happened with the Obama administration, "Not my president." And going forward, whoever wins, there'll be a significant section saying, "Not my president." And there's a tendency to stop listening. Now, how do you run, how does an administration oversee an incredibly large, incredibly diverse, incredibly complex society that refuses to acknowledge legitimacy, or at least 50% of it refuse to acknowledge the legitimacy of the leader? That's a really difficult question. And unfortunately, the political partisanship does not offer us a way out of that challenge. One of the things I wrote about when I was in the US was I wrote about how in some ways America has become two nations, a green state and a red state and a blue state. And they don't watch the same news, their views and their conversations rarely overlap. CNN, ABC, NPR is what the Democrats are drawn to. Fox and other websites and news sources is what the Republicans are drawn to, and rarely do these sources overtake. So we have this issue of legitimacy in one part and a lack of ability to talk to each other in another part because they're having very different conversations. And so this is a challenge confronting the next administration. How do you overcome that, especially and most likely that whoever wins will face a hostile opposition? So if Biden wins, the Republicans will move, the Republicans may move to treat him like they did Obama, that is, stop everything or stop all reform. And if the Republicans win, then there'll be another 4 years of Trump, and there will be continued attacks and refusal to negotiate. So it really is a difficult situation for the country to face, and I don't think there's an easy way forward. It can only be seen from a long-term perspective.